Hola, I'm Joe Pardavila, and you're listening to the Forbes Books Podcast. And so much has changed in this country in the past couple of years. Some good and some bad. But one of the positives is the rapid growth of corporate diversity, equity, and inclusion programs. One report stated that the number of DEI-related job postings increased by 123% in 2020. And joining me this week is Dr. Nika White, the president and CEO of Nika White Consulting, and the author of Intentional Inclusionist and Next Level Inclusionist, Transform Your Work and Your Life for Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion Success. Dr. Nika, how are you?
I am very well, Joe. How are you?
I'm excellent, and I'd love to step back because the work you've been doing goes back years. And then 2020 rolls around where this sort of like social upheaval, social awareness of what's been going on in our society that you were fully, keenly aware of before 2020 happened. When that came down, were you like, finally, people are understanding what's going on? Was there like I know it was kind of a crappy time for all of us, but did that sort of like pressure just come off your shoulders like, oh my God, thankfully, that now people are aware?
You know, Joe, it's such an interesting question because it was bittersweet. I mean, to your point, I have been doing this work now for a number of years, well beyond, 2020 when it became such a heightened awareness for people to lean into the conversations regarding diversity, equity, and inclusion. And it was, of course, as we all are aware of, after the murder of George Floyd, that was so visible and so hard for people. And so for me, I felt that it was bittersweet. I mean, while I think all of us were trying to find a way to heal as a community because we all were impacted in some capacity or another, and particularly those who are part of the Black and Brown communities. And so, yes, in many ways, I think all of us wanted to make sure that his murder was not in vain and that we could take that tragedy and really make something become of it. So for me as a practitioner, yes, it was quite exciting and overwhelming and bittersweet to see the influx of interest and people wanting to be a part of this conversation in a much more deepened, committed way. But yeah, it was a mixed emotions. I have to be honest, mixed emotions.
And you pretty much your expertise is in the DEI field. And I'm sure now most people understand what DEI means. But going back 5 years, were people like, is that some sort of branch of the government? What does that even mean? Take me back to those days.
Sure. Well, language has shifted a lot. People have all types of acronyms that they leverage for really talking about the broad work of diversity, equity, and inclusion, belonging, justice. At the core of it, though, is all about humanity. And so I am of the persuasion that I think sometimes that actually can produce more confusion when we continue to put all these labels around it. It just gives someone else another opportunity to have to question, what is this again? After we've spent so much time getting people to engage in the first place. And so, I mean, at its core, it is about humanity. It is about allowing people to show up at their best and, providing a pathway where people can feel accepted and valued and seen and heard and full opportunity for success. And how that shows forth in practice, there are so many different ways that I could talk about that. But yeah, this is not a new conversation. I realize that for a lot of people, it feels like it is a new conversation because of the heightened interest over the past, couple years. But this body of work has been deeply embedded into many organizations at some capacity. But what it has done over the past, most recent years is created this now groundswell of support for the work. And I think that that's allowing many organizations to be further along in their journey. And that's exciting to see.
And without dating you, you have been doing this for a couple decades, over 20 years or so, which is a good thing. I don't want to be an ageist and be like, oh my God, she's been doing this for so long. But can you take me back to those early days being a practitioner of diversity and inclusion? I'm just curious, like, what was it like? It almost feels like the Stone Ages at this point, 20 years. I mean, we've moved so fast recently, but what were those early days like?
Yeah. So, Joe, it's interesting. I did not set out to be a practitioner in this space. I often share that this work somehow found me. But as a Black woman in the South, I have always been keenly aware of systems of oppression and of inequities and microaggressions And so because I've, that those have been part of my lived experiences as a Black woman, I think I've often found myself sensitized to wanting to lean in where I could, either from a volunteer perspective or just the interest that I took in certain projects and initiatives and activities. It wasn't until I was in marketing communications that I saw that there was a potential career path for me to really pursue that allowed me to do this work in a more consistent and formal way. But when you work for an advertising agency and your goal is to be smart marketing partners to your clients' constituencies who represent diverse America, it certainly causes you to take heed of the need of having different people at the table as you are creating these messaging strategies. And so that was my story. I was in marketing communications, and I was in between an office in Greenville, South Carolina. That was the agency that I worked for. It was actually headquartered in Greenville, South Carolina, but it also had a presence in New York. And so I would go to the New York office often. And I was just quite enamored with the level of diversity. And what I didn't know at the time is that that level of diversity was not sufficient, so much so to where the Attorney General was kind of knocking on the offices of these different agencies in the advertising capital of the world, New York. And they were saying, you have to diversify. The industry depends upon it. This is not a suggestion. It's more of a mandate. We'll be back in 6 months to see how you're doing. Well, no one was paying attention to what was happening in Greenville, South Carolina, again, which is where I was from and based. But I knew that the BHAG, the big, hairy, audacious goal for the agency that I work for, was to become the most admired agency in the Southeast. And so that led me to really contemplate, do we want to wait for someone to knock on our door to place a mandate, or do we want to show forth leadership and enter into this space with great level of intentionality and deepen our commitment around diversity, equity, and inclusion? So I couldn't let that go.
So you walked away from a pretty good job, it sounds like.
Well, so I did not so much walk away, but I did have a very direct and sincere conversation with the president CEO, who was very hands-on, by the way. I had a great rapport with him. He was quite accessible. And I just shared this narrative of how I love what I do. I love the agency environment and the culture. It's hard work. It's always on time, on budget, on strategy, but I love that. But I also realized that we were not leaning into an opportunity that I think could help us reach that BHAG. And it was all about intentionality around diversity, equity, and inclusion. And so the president CEO listened very intently. He asked some very thoughtful questions. And at the end of that conversation, in essence, what happened is I then found myself in this dual role where I was also beginning to lead and facilitate the DEI work for the agency. And slowly but surely, it became something that I knew was going to be a part of my career trajectory going forward.
And you speak of the word intentionality. You even wrote the book, The Intentional Inclusionist. The word's been used a lot more recently than I think ever in my lifetime. Like being intentional about not even just about DEI, but like being intentional about, company culture, being intentional about, so why do you think that word, and I guess, again, you're ahead of the game. You're ahead of the curve. Why is the word intentional? Why is that so important?
Oh, I love this question so much, Joe. The word intentional, or any variation thereof, intentionality, intent, it has so much power behind it. It is the key separator, I believe, from individuals who are more about rhetoric and they want to shift from that to being more about action, maximizing, being a finisher, and actualizing a lot of what they may be endeavoring to do. It has a certain look and feel about it. I mean, it is calculated, it is calibrated, it requires being strategic and foresight. It requires belief and being committed to whatever the journey you're on, what you're hoping for in the end, that you're being intentional about is going to be worth it. And I think that's such an important message for the work of diversity, equity, and inclusion. The bottom line is that for equity and inclusion, diversity is already here and happening. We don't have to do anything to create diversity, but that is vastly different from equity and inclusion, which requires a great level of intentionality. So I believe in the power of the word, and I think that it's part of what I believe is the entryway for people to really begin to actualize the impact that I think our society deserves around inclusion and belonging and equity.
And in the aforementioned book, you kind of lay out the philosophies of leadership. And I'm curious, how did those philosophies develop within you? Was it just something that organically happened, or was it something that you were intentional to create a philosophy?
Yeah, well, I often say that being inclusion minded and strengthening and having a strong inclusion minded muscle, it's all about being intentional, but it has a growth capability to it. And so it certainly takes people being willing to first and foremost recognize that there is a deficiency, right? There is a gap, just like any other skill sets that we deem to be critically important, like people management or conflict resolution management. I mean, all of those things, those soft skills, or I like to refer to them as power skills because there's nothing soft about those skills at all. They're critically important. But the same rings true for inclusion, being inclusion minded. And I think that what happens is too many people will assume that the work of inclusion and equity is solely the responsibility of those who carry the title of like chief diversity officer, manager, director, or even the HR professionals. And what I believe is an important opportunity for us to amplify is that each of us, we have influence that we can leverage to help create and foster inclusivity and belonging. So it's not just about a title. So when I talk about inclusive leadership, it's not in the context of positionality, but it's about that influence. And that creates an opportunity for more people to then own the work, to be accountable for the work, and to see it as part of what their journey should look like, and not just, again, for a separate group of people.
It's so funny. It reminds me of when you speak to leaders about recruiting talent, they say the best recruiters aren't your HR department. It's the people you have who work there, the people who go and tell their friends, "Oh my God, you got to work for this company. They're so great. It's such a great environment. Everyone's, everyone works well together. It's a great team." And in a way, that's sort of how the DEI works as well. It's not just having the DEI officer; it's having everyone on board feeling the same thing.
Yes. This work belongs to all of us, right? All of us. And I think that the sooner that we as a society can really become much more sophisticated about that concept, we're going to be better off. Yes, it's for all of us.
So, Dr. Nika, speaking of the social uprising of 2020, as we started this conversation, one of the things a lot of companies did to embrace the Black Lives Matter was to posterize their buildings, their websites with Black Lives Matter. But my question is, and bringing back the word intentionality, how intentional are these companies to support Black Lives Matter within when it comes to hiring practices and developing leaders within an organization that are Black and brown? Over the last couple of years, what are you seeing in that regard?
Joe, I think that some organizations really work hard to be effective in that regard. And then there are others who are more interested in the performative aspect of it. How can it, help their brand? But I will tell you, there are a lot of people these days that just from a consumer end perspective, and even employees who are really committed to this work, they're calling in those behaviors, right? and so in that regard, I think that level of potential risk for that criticism has caused a greater number of companies to be a bit more thoughtful about it. Still a lot of room to improve. I even think about the fact that we're entering Black History Month, Black Heritage Month, and I've seen a lot of messages where companies have really tried to show forth their way of celebrating Black heritage, Black history, and it has created more of an adverse effect because people do not buy into the authenticity and the meaningfulness behind it. They're seeing it as performative. And so I talk often about intent versus impact. The bottom line is that I think that we so very much need to take ownership of the impact, whether we intend for it to create a negative impact, because harm still has generated a lot of bias and oppression that continues to perpetuate itself. And so I often use the example, you can step on my toe and you can say that you're sorry, and I can know that you're sorry and that you didn't mean to do it. But guess what? My toe still hurts, right? That's an impact there. And somebody needs to own that. And that's what I think that sometimes is missed from the conversation from an organizational perspective. I would love to see organizations get even more committed to systems change and not just these individualized actions or programs. I think that that's one way to approach it, but it's not the way to sustain the work.
Yeah, and a perfect example of that, Dr. Nika, is I'm not sure if you're following the Brian Flores story in the NFL, but essentially the NFL has this rule where when there's a job opening, they must interview a person of color for that job.
The Rooney Rule.
Rooney Rule, yeah. So what happened with the Brian Flores situation was they had hired a coach for the New York Giants job, but then scheduled an interview with him afterwards to fulfill the Rooney Rule. And now he's suing the NFL, and it's just, and again, goes back to what you're talking about being performative. The NFL has this rule in place. They're playing it out where they're interviewing these people without a chance of that person getting hired. And that's, to me, is probably at this point in, obviously you're the expert in this, but to me, that is the worst part of everything that's happening in the DEI sect, is that it's all on the surface and it's not being done deep enough.
Right. It's deceitful. It's hurtful. It's degrading. It sets us back so much. And so what I appreciate, though, are the people who are brave enough to call those behaviors out, because I do think that the more we expose people, the greater level of accountability that people will assume ownership of. And so it's heartbreaking that that is still a reality today. But yes, there are a number of organizations that I'm sure find themselves stating that they have very inclusive practices, particularly around hiring and promotions and things of that nature. But if you were to really, look at the track record and see the level of rigor and diligence in which they're trying to implement those strategies, I would, probably say that a large percentage are missing the mark.
Yeah. And with the Brian Flores situation, I mean, it takes his sacrifice, because he's actually come out and said, listen, I'll probably never get a job in the NFL now because of this, but I have to do this for the next generation. And as someone who's lived this life, Dr. Nika, is it frustrating that people of color still have to make sacrifices for the next generation instead of just being like, hey, can I take advantage of this?
It's incredibly frustrating. Here's the thing. I know that not everybody has the emotional capital to be those trailblazers and the ones who call and expose people, where they need to, or practices and behaviors where they need to. But for those who are willing to, it's making a difference. We stand on the shoulders, and we, meaning a lot of people of color, we stand on the shoulders of so many that have come before us that help pave the way, that for those of us that can continue the fight, and I use that word loosely because the fight looks so much different now than it did, several decades ago. We do need those individuals, but I'm also very much keenly aware that not everyone has that emotional capital. And so I appreciate when people can have that level of self-awareness to where they know this could be harmful to me if I start to engage in a way that is, not necessarily the best interest of my mental health, right? We're all dealing with so much right now that I never pass judgment on someone who decides that they don't want to necessarily be the one who is trying to create this pathway of systemic change. And that's a big feat for anyone.
And you've often said that DEI is more than just a business strategy. It's a way to transform the world. And you see it on a day-to-day basis in terms of the government kind of like, without getting into pandemic stuff, but you see the government stepping back and then businesses having to step forward. Why do you think the DEI efforts in business will transform the world?
Because I think that business, just collectively, business is certainly seen as a sector that has tremendous amount of power and value. It's how we operate, And I think that those, large employers, even the small and mid-sized employers who are, hiring people and, creating impact in whatever regard, they have voice. It's interesting. I saw a shift in language after George Floyd's murder, where we used to talk about corporate social responsibility. Now I'm seeing some organizations that are very deliberately referring to that as corporate social justice. And what that says to me is that businesses that have been historically on the sidelines being quiet about some of these systemic social complex issues are now saying we do have power, we do have voice, we can influence change in this regard. And so let's get active and let's leverage our voice. And I think that's incredibly needed, and I think it's definitely what's going to help us to see a shift.
Which sort of segues nicely into what your day job is as Nika White Consulting. Can you tell us what's happening there?
Sure. So, Nika White Consulting is a management consulting firm, and we intersect the work of diversity, equity, and inclusion with leadership in business. So we work with all types of clients, different industries, different sectors, different sizes, helping them to integrate into their business framework, strategic diversity, intentional inclusion, and a lens of equity. We are a 100% remote work organization, not because of the pandemic, but because that's been our business model since the inception. And it serves us well. Our clients are all over, even we have some global clients. And so our colleagues are all over. So it really does make for a good model.
And how does that work with the company that you decide to work with? Is it, obviously there's a lot of relationships involved, but do they just call you up saying, hey, we'd love to have you work with us? And then do you have to dig in and sort of like look under the hood before you start your consulting?
Yeah, it's a great question, Joe. And I would say that the entry point for most of our clients that we have the privilege of supporting their DEI journeys, we have a exploratory discovery conversation. We really see ourselves as an extension of our clients' teams. And so we want to understand, what are your pain points? What are your challenges? What body of work from a DEIB perspective has taken place so far? And where do you see that you want to improve? And so those initial conversations are very instrumental in helping us to decide, first and foremost, if we are a match. We don't at all pretend to be a one size fits all, type of organization. We really want to make sure that there is good alignment in our philosophies and how in which we like to show up to this work. So there are certain questions that we like to ask, and the same way that, clients are asking us questions to see if we're a good fit. But yes, looking under the hood for us, what that often is a deep dive assessment where we are leveraging both qualitative and quantitative data collection strategies to help us to really understand the culture, the environment, the programmatic and operational procedures. And all of that is what lends to really useful information that serves to inform a strategic path forward around diversity, equity, inclusion for that specific organization.
That's cool. And you're still based in Greenville, but like you said, work internationally. And I'm
Yeah.
curious, I started living in the Low Country, the Charleston, South Carolina in 2020, which is always a great time to relocate. But the one thing I always like to joke to folks, and my friends back in New York, is that I live in the little blue dot of a giant red state. And as you
Yeah.
know, this great state of South Carolina is a little behind on
Yeah.
a lot of things. One, for example, that's currently in the news is there's no hate crime laws in the books here, which
Yeah,
is
right.
shocking for me to hear. So someone who's lived here their whole life, and obviously someone who must love the state, how much does it pain you and hurt you to see that this state that you love, place that you've settled roots in, built a company and built an empire, basically, they don't seem to really believe in everything that you believe in?
Yeah, Joe, I am aware that Greenville has its stains, right? We have our challenges, and not just Greenville, but the state of South
Mm.
Carolina, to take it back to the specific question. But having been doing this work for quite some time, seeing organizations all over the country, I will tell you that there are a lot of places that we may perceive to be really progressive that are just as equally challenged as some of the South Carolina based, organizations. And so I know the perception of Carolinas is out there. I tend to like to take a strength based approach. I mean, while we've done a lot of things that we needed to course correct for, I also believe in. I believe in our state. I believe in the people in our state. I think that for those that are really committed to this work, you're going to find them continuing to work their fingers to the bone to be champions of this work. I am in Greenville, and one of the stories that I often tell is that Greenville was the last county in the nation to recognize MLK as an official holiday. And while that certainly left a stain on Greenville in the minds of many, because obviously it made national news and it certainly painted a picture of Dr. King. I can remember to this day driving down 385 and seeing a billboard with Dr. King's likeness. And the billboard said, "Do you recognize this man? Greenville County doesn't."
Oof.
And that was heartbreaking.
Wow.
And, there was a lot of division in our community as people were fighting to get this holiday passed. And so we needed to heal. And so I remember after that, it was a group of us kind of came together and we started thinking about what can we do to change this narrative, right? While we may have been the last county in the nation, how can we not be remembered as being the last county in the nation? And so we began to develop what we referred to as MLK Dream Weekend. And as part of that weekend, there was a multitude of different opportunities that were designed to help bring forth a greater sense of community. So there were job fairs and health fairs and diversity banquets. And we were fortunate that in our very first year, we were able to get Dr. Bernice King, Dr. King's daughter, to come and be our keynote speaker. And if you can imagine, this
Wow.
is the weekend of MLK, and she could have been anywhere. but she saw fit to be at our event. And the message that night, I will never forget it. She basically presented to us that Greenville, yes, this is something that's part of now of who you are in terms of how you're known and seen right now, but the last shall be first. And that was so healing for our community. And so I tend to like to not necessarily acknowledge that, yes, we have some challenges, but I like to also take a strength-based approach because I think that we need hope. We need hope. And I want us to continue to feel like we can get better, and get better year after year.
From reading up on you and having this delightful discussion, I feel like for you, DEI is not a destination. It's more of like a journey. Like there is no end to it. And I think you wrote recently, expect and accept that there won't be closure. So when you speak to folks about this and the fact that it's not like, it's not like a cybersecurity thing that companies sign up for, like, hey, take this class and everyone's going to be cyber secure. How do you inform and educate people that this is a long game? This is not something that you just do. You pop in a 2-hour video, like when you were in high school, the teacher didn't want to teach, they popped the video in. It's not something that can be done over like a little webinar. How do you let these people know that this is something you're in it for the long haul?
Yeah, it's definitely a journey. It's certainly not a destination. So you're right about that, Joe. I think that the acknowledgement of the fact that people are entering these conversations of DEI at different places within their own personal learning journey and with different mental models about what it is, what it's not. A large part of my work is often centered around helping people to unlearn misinformation about diversity, equity, and inclusion. And so, but I think that acknowledging that each of us are at different places, sometimes it can help with people recognizing that, yes, this is a journey. Because sometimes if we sense that we need to be automatically fully woke day one, then that's going to maybe cause us to have a little trepidation about engaging. And we need everyone to be a part of this work so that we all can emerge stronger. So it's really about bringing people along and recognizing there's not going to be one singular way in which it's going to appeal to everyone and resonate with everyone. I do believe that it's also a business imperative as well as a moral imperative. And so, people are motivated by different factors. Even from like a learning an exposure and awareness perspective, I always recommend companies to not just have your formal, training, if you will. I don't even like the word training. I like to use learning and development experiences because training sounds like a destination, but when it's an experience, you can build upon it. Right. And I think that we have to consider people learn in different ways. They receive information in different ways. And so can we build a library of a multitude of ways in which people can deepen their understanding, whether it's by films and books and webinars and informal, learning and development sessions, as well as maybe just separate, more informal, safe space conversations. So we're going to have to get creative and innovative in our approach to bringing as many people along as possible instead of continuing to just think about it in a very narrow fashion.
And you use the word woke there. And I'm old enough to remember that the word woke was sort of like a positive word, but somehow it's been weaponized into like almost like a curse word. Does it bother you that the fact that it's been lost in translation, that now woke means like, the M&M, the female M&M has to wear sneakers now or something like that? Is it weird that like a word that really meant to be enlightened, to be informed is now a negative?
Well, I'll tell you what bothers me is the council culture. I am not a fan at all of the council culture. I understand how it came into existence, but I feel like it is counterproductive. It does not serve us well. When we counsel people out because of our perception of how woke they are or not, then I think it just drives people away. It creates greater divides and division. And I want people to do this work because of and not in spite of. And there's a difference. And so again, I'm not a fan of the council culture. And that's where I see some of the negative connotation around, the language like woke, because it's like, if you're not woke, then, you're not with the end times and we don't really want to talk with you. You can't be a part of our team, our group. Right. And I don't think that's the right way.
Yeah, it's funny. There was a comedian a few years ago that said, I don't understand cancel culture. So what does that mean? So that guy or woman, that they're canceled, they can't earn a living. So if they, they can't be on TV. So is it okay if they work at a grocery store? Yeah, cancel culture it's got a lot of problems.
Yes, it does. It does. Absolutely.
Well, let's finish on a high note here. Talk to me about your partnership with Forbes Books and what that means to you going forward.
Oh, well, I am super excited, Joe, to be working on book number three, and even more excited to be doing it with such a phenomenal brand like Forbes. So far, the experience has been tremendous. I have been well supported, and writing a book can be quite daunting, and it can it has an intimidation factor that's attached to it if you aren't careful. But when you're surrounded by people who are committed to your success and invested in your message and your platform, it certainly helps the process to be less daunting. And so I've been very appreciative of that so far. We are somewhat in the early stages for release later this year, but I have my master book plan, and we've been, connecting with other key resources to help really position us for success. And I'm feeling really good about it.
Awesome. And for folks who are finding out about you now, what's the best way to find out more information about you?
The best way is through my website, which is nikawhite.com. So NIKAWHITE. That's my business website, Nika White Consulting. But I also have a personal website, which is mostly for my speaking opportunities, and that is nikawhitespeaks.com.
Awesome. Dr. Nika, thank you so much for the time. I really appreciate it.
Well, Joe, I have appreciated the opportunity to share space with you and to share a little bit more about what's going on in my world. And so thank you for the opportunity.
You're welcome. And that's it for this edition of the Forbes Books Podcast. If you enjoyed the show, make sure you take a quick second to subscribe so you automatically get new shows when they drop. Also, if you have a minute, I would love if you left us a review so more amazing entrepreneurs like yourself can discover the show. And please don't forget the golden rule and treat others as you want to be treated. Thanks for listening. Until next time, adios.